Hello everyone, I'm author Steven Donahue, and today I'm going to be reading to you Chapter 2 from my brand new book, The Almighty Accused. Now this chapter does deal with a school shooting, so please be warned. And this is Chapter 2 of The Almighty Accused. Nolan Mitchell rushed up the steps to the third-floor classroom as the school bell rang overhead. He was late again, and he dreaded hearing another lecture from Miss Silverstein about tardiness. He weaved his way through the crowd of students who still hadn't cleared the hallway before slipping inside room 304. Nolan slunk past his teacher, who was busy erasing words from the chalkboard, and quietly found his seat in the fourth row. Beside him, Colleen whispered that he was late. He smiled back at her with a shrug. Nolan took out his cell phone and texted Colleen. "Couldn't help it," he wrote. "Nature called." He watched her read the message as she crinkled her nose. She put her phone into her backpack and leaned forward in her seat. "Settle down, everyone," said Miss Silverstein. She faced her students and paused for a moment. "As we continue our study of the Holocaust, we're going to focus today on something you might not have heard about before." The teacher sat on the edge of her desk. Legend has it that a small group of Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz put God on trial for breaking the covenant with the Jewish people. The teacher reached down and picked up a small book. "Have any of you read the book Night by Elie Wiesel?" she asked. She raised the book so everyone could see the cover. Most of the students shook their heads. She put the book down. There are no official documents to prove that the trial occurred, but Mr. Wiesel claims that he was there when it happened. Should we believe him, she asked. Colleen raised her hand and Miss Silverstein called on her. "My great-grandfather used to tell that story to his kids," he said, "and my dad told us about it. I think it did happen." She glanced over at Nolan, who raised his eyebrows. Colleen nodded. "Thank you, Colleen," said Miss Silverstein. "That brings up an excellent point. This is a story that's been shared for generations now, and I believe there is some truth to it." She folded her hands in her lap. "Today, and for the next few classes, we're going to watch a BBC film based on the story. It's called God on Trial. I won't spoil the ending for you by revealing the verdict." Miss Silverstein rose and picked up the remote control from her desk. She turned and pointed it toward a large screen television that sat on a mobile stand in front of the chalkboard. She slowly walked to the back of the classroom and sat in one of the chairs as the program started. The students shuffled in their seat to get comfortable. Nolan kept his cell phone in his lap and slyly played pinball as he pretended to watch the film. He looked up from time to time as the actors discussed the problem at hand. He noticed that Colleen was intently focused on the drama on screen. What a nerd, he thought. A text alert caused Nolan to pause his game. He quickly read the message. It was from Darby, who sat 2 rows over on Nolan's right side. "Careful," it said. "Silverstein is watching you." Nolan glanced at Darby, who had been his best friend since the 2nd grade, and he quickly shut off his cell phone. Nolan pretended to clear his throat as he slipped the phone into the pocket of his jacket that was hanging over the back of his chair. Nolan jumped his fingers on his desk as he tried to get interested in the film. He soon found himself tapping to the tune of Queen's "We Will Rock You," and he instinctively bobbed his head. His eyes drifted around the classroom. Most of the kids were watching the film, but a few were clearly looking down at their cell phones. A half an hour into the film, Colleen raised her hand. The teacher acknowledged her. Colleen tried to whisper. "Can I please go to the bathroom?" she asked. Miss Silverstein nodded. Colleen rose and whacked Nolan's right shoulder as she passed him. They smiled at each other, and Nolan watched her leave the classroom. He wanted to resume his pinball game, but he thought better of it. Nolan folded his hands to keep his fingers still. The film didn't hold his attention, as he preferred car chases and quick-cut action scenes rather than intense dialogue. He glanced over at Colleen's empty desk. She left a notebook open with a pen resting on top of it. The 13-year-old boy felt his eyes grow heavy as he watched the historical drama. He rubbed his right cheek and took a deep breath. The rock song still played in his head. Nolan glanced at the clock on the wall. There were still 25 minutes left in class, and he wondered how he could stay awake until the end. He also began to wonder why Colleen was taking so long in the girls' room. A sudden booming sound came from the hallway. The students all looked toward the door as Miss Silverstein rose from her seat. Nolan wondered if someone had lit some firecrackers. The sound repeated and was quickly joined by screams and the pounding of footsteps. Nolan glanced at Darby, who shrugged. Miss Silverstein rushed over to the classroom door. Her face whitened as she looked back at her kids. "Shelter in place," she yelled. The students automatically rushed to the far wall and dropped to the floor as they had in previous drills. Nolan saw Miss Silverstein try to push a table toward the door. He sprinted over to her and grabbed the other side of the table. Darby followed close behind him and grabbed the other end. The boys lifted the table and dropped it in front of the door after Miss Silverstein locked it. "Go with the others," she said. Nolan wouldn't budge. "What about Colleen?" he asked, suddenly out of breath. "She's still out there." Darby grabbed Nolan's left arm and tried to pull him away from the door. Nolan shook him off. "We have to find her," he said. "She will shelter wherever she is," said Miss Silverstein. She put her hands on both boys and pushed them toward the other students. She turned off the lights and joined the boys as they sprinted to the other side of the room. The teacher stopped for a moment to turn off the television, then she hid with her students. Everyone kept quiet as they stared at the classroom door. Some of the girls were crying, but doing their best not to make noise. Nolan heard someone texting, and he wished he had his cell phone with him. He turned and saw Miss Silverstein as she dialed 911 on her cell phone. She spoke in a hushed tone as she told the operator what was happening. A whiff of urine rose from the crowd, and Nolan was surprised that it wasn't from him. He looked over at Darby. The boy's body was shaking, and his fists were balled. The smaller boy was struggling to breathe, and Nolan worried he might be having an asthma attack. He watched his friend pull an inhaler from his pocket and bring it to his mouth. Darby puffed on the device in his shaking hand. More booming sounds came from the hallway, only they were louder than before. Nolan realized the shooter was getting closer. His eyes widened and he held his breath when he saw the silhouette of someone holding a rifle as the figure reached their door. The person turned the doorknob. It rattled a few times as some of the kids gasped. Nolan crawled across the floor toward the classroom door. Miss Silverstein told him to stop, but he ignored her. The boy rose to his feet and grabbed a chair, holding it like a lion tamer. The doorknob rattled again, and Nolan tightened his grip on his weapon. He felt sweat rush down his face. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Darby stand up. Miss Silverstein grabbed Darby's arm, and she pulled him back down before he could join his friend. The figure began to move away from the door when one of the terrified students sneezed. The armed assailant stopped and tapped the door with his weapon. The students recoiled in fear. Nolan felt his breathing increase, and he forced himself to slow it down. His eyes burned from the sweat. He felt the chair begin to slip from his grip. Nolan quickly wiped each hand while focusing on maintaining his grasp on the chair. More footsteps thundered toward the classroom from the hallway, and Nolan watched the armed figure move past their room. He glanced at his teacher, who was frantically waving her hands at him. Nolan took a deep breath and slowly lowered the chair to the floor. He stepped around the chair and darted across the classroom before dropping down next to Darby. Nolan ignored his teacher's admonishment as he checked on his best friend. "Are you all right?" he asked Darby. The smaller boy nodded as he gripped his inhaler. Darby's breathing sounded less labored. Nolan nodded at his friend before turning to face Miss Silverstein. "What do we do now?" he asked her. "We sit and we wait," she said, quietly and with no more heroics. She whispered the same to the other students. Her hands shook as her voice cracked as she spoke. Nolan could see that she was terrified too, but she did her best to hold it together. Nolan stared at the clock above the chalkboard. He followed the seconds hand as it ticked slowly in circles. He rubbed his eyes every so often, and he bit his bottom lip to distract him from the pain of his cramping legs. Most of the other students remained flat on their stomachs, but some sat up, nervously rocking themselves. A few kids held hands. The weeping had stopped before the foul smell in the room intensified as more kids had trouble holding their urine. A crackling sound came over the loudspeaker system. "This is Principal Haynes," said a deep, shaking voice. "The police have captured a gunman, but they have not given us the all-clear yet. Please remain where you are as officers sweep the building." Nolan stood up and shook his achy legs. Other kids turned and hugged each other while some cheered. Miss Silverstein immediately cut off the premature celebration. "Everyone please keep quiet until after the officers arrive," she said. "This might not be over yet." Miss Silverstein drifted over toward Nolan and Darby. "Nolan," she said in a scolding tone, "you should have tried to stop that gunman on your own," she said. "Had he come in here, you could have easily been hurt or killed." She paused and her voice softened. "But I do understand why you did it." She hugged Nolan and then placed a motherly hand on Darby's right shoulder. The classroom door opened and 3 uniformed officers in riot gear entered the room with their rifles drawn. The students froze in fear again. The lead officer turned toward his partners. "All clear," he said, lowering his rifle. They did the same. "We're going to check you for weapons." Once you are cleared, you'll need to move quickly and quietly out of the classroom, said the lead officer. The students did as they were told, and Nolan was the first one out of the room. Once in the hallway, he turned toward the nearest bathrooms to look for his sister. He walked past several police officers and emergency responders. His stomach tightened at the sight of the blood on the victims on the floor. Officers waved unhurt students toward the exits, but Nolan lingered as he continued his search. "Colleen," he shouted over the noise of the hallway. "Colleen, where are you?" He edged his way through the crowd, repeating his cry. Several kids bumped into him on their way out of the building. He fended them off and moved his head around to try and see through the mass of moving bodies. Some students stood and cried while others hugged their friends. The authorities struggled to maintain order in the hallway. Nolan felt a hand on his left shoulder and he immediately shook it off. "Come on, kid, you need to clear out of here," said a uniformed police officer. The lawman grabbed Nolan again with a better grip. Nolan glared at the bearded man and tried to wrestle free. "Don't make me drag you out of here," said the officer. Nolan sighed. "I'm looking for my sister, Colleen Mitchell," he said to the officer. "She was out here when the shooting started. Have you seen her?" he asked. The officer shrugged. "What does she look like?" he asked. The boy described her. "I don't know," said the officer. "I've seen a lot of kids today. Listen, go outside with the others. Odds are she's already out there." Darby appeared behind the officer. Nolan looked at his friend. "Have you seen Colleen?" he asked. "She was out here before, remember?" Darby frowned and shook his head. "We have to find her," said Nolan. He ignored the officer and pushed his way toward the nearest corner. Darby followed him. Teachers tried to usher the students out of the building, but few were listening to them. Nolan saw the bodies of two boys sprawled out on the floor. Both lay in pools of blood and neither moved. A blonde girl stood over them, weeping as she shook one of the bodies. Nolan recognized both of the boys from his math class. He stopped and watched in horror as an EMT finally arrived and checked the bodies for life signs. Nolan had to pull himself away from the gruesome scene. He forced himself to continue his search. His legs hurt and his head throbbed for the noise and confusion. He looked at Darby as the smaller boy wiped tears from his eyes. "We've got to find her," said Nolan. Darby quietly nodded and followed his friend. The boys reached the end of the hall, and they were stalled by the mass of students who had stopped in front of the science lab. Nolan pushed his way through and saw the prone figure on the cement floor. It was Mr. Albertson, a popular science teacher. Nolan had his class during third period. Blood seeped out of a gaping hole in the man's chest. Nolan watched a police officer drape a white sheet over the body. Nolan felt bile rise in his throat. He rushed to the nearest bathroom, stood over a toilet, and vomited. The vile fluid burned his throat as the boy spit out the last of it. He turned to see Darby holding some wet paper towels. Nolan took the towels and wiped his face. Darby put a hand on Nolan's right shoulder. "It's okay," said Darby. Nolan nodded before moving toward the sink. He washed his face and hands and rinsed his mouth. Nolan dried his hands with more paper towels and tried to regain his composure. "Maybe that cop was right," said Darby. "Maybe Colleen is already outside. She might even be looking for you." Nolan reluctantly nodded. "Maybe," he said. "Let's see." The boys exited the bathroom and slipped in through the immovable crowd into the hallway. More police and EMTs arrived. They tended to the injured students while trying to maintain some sense of order. Nolan tried not to get distracted by the familiar faces of the crying and shaking students. He wanted to help them all, but first he had to be sure that Colleen was all right. The boys were close to an exit when they saw two EMTs leaning over another body on a hallway floor. Nolan's face whitened when he saw the victim's auburn hair that closely matched Colleen's. He dashed forward, pushing some other students out of the way. He stopped inches from the girl and dropped to his knees. Colleen's body convulsed as the medical personnel performed CPR. Her eyes were open, but she seemed to stare unknowingly at the ceiling. Nolan saw gunshot wounds to her chest and right shoulder. The EMTs had stopped the bleeding, but they struggled to revive her. Nolan saw her lips move, but he wasn't sure if they were trembling or if she was trying to say something. Nolan took her right hand. "I'm here, Colleen," he said. "I'm right here." He hoped that she could hear him and understand him. "Please, don't go. Please." He felt her hand felt cold, and her skin was pale. One EMT told Nolan to back up, but he ignored the order. Nolan's eyes filled with tears as his head shook in disbelief. The medical duo finally stopped their efforts. One of them turned toward Nolan. "I'm sorry, son," he said. He placed a hand on Nolan's right shoulder. "She's gone." The man turned to his partner and nodded. The duo packed up their gear, and the one who tried to comfort Nolan placed a white sheet over Colleen's body. Nolan fell back onto his tailbone. He sat on the floor as his entire body shook. He looked around in confusion and could not make out the words come out of his mouth. Time passed, but he couldn't tell how much. Everything swirled around him, even as he felt a pair of hands slip under his shoulders. Something lifted him to his feet. Dizziness made him wobbly, and those hands struggled to keep him upright. Those hands were soon around Nolan's body. "I'm sorry, Nolan," said Darby, who was hugging his friend and trying to keep him upright. "Come on, we need to get out of here." Darby tried to push Nolan away from the horrific scene, but Nolan wouldn't move. Darby put his hands on his friend's face. "Listen to me," said Darby. "We need to leave. Now." They stood toe-to-toe for a moment until a primal fear, understanding, finally hit Nolan. He wiped his eyes and found the exit again. With Darby at his heels, Nolan stumbled toward the open doors. He stepped outside and saw the whirlwind of activity in the courtyard. The parking lot beyond the grass was filled with police cars and ambulances, with their lights flashing. Uniformed officers were either treating injured people or trying to maintain order. Cars carrying worried parents and relatives poured into the parking lot, each screeching to a halt. Nolan saw kids hugging their parents and friends. Most of them were crying. Nolan saw an empty bench and he hobbled over to it. He sat down with Darby at his side. Nolan noticed the tears running down his friend's face. He looked around again and everything seemed so unreal, like he were watching a disaster film. Nolan dropped his head into his hands. How can this happen, he wondered. That was Chapter 2 of The Almighty Accused, and this book is now available on Amazon.com. So get your copy today and enjoy the rest of the book.